Before we fully engage in the process of creating our ASCII art, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about some of the differences between what's happening over here in the text editor and what's happening over here in our executable and in our program. Now, the technical word for what's in between these quotation marks is it's called a string literal. And a string is a particular data type in the Python programming language that we'll be discussing in great detail later. And part of the reason the word literal is there, because what is in between those quotation marks is literally exactly what I want to appear over here. So if I come over here and alter hello world by maybe adding 2 more spaces, if I rerun the program, you will see a change to what is over here in the executable. However, if I come over here and in between my left parenthesis and the start of my quotation mark, if I were to add 3 spaces right here and run the program, you will not see any difference to the output. This is because I've made my changes outside of the string literal. And at this point in the program, when my cursor is right here before the quotation marks, I'm just working within the Python programming language. And one thing that our compiler does when it reads this line of code is it ignores white space that is occurring here. So, no harm, no foul. It reads these 3 spaces and quite literally ignores them, treating them as though there weren't any spaces here at all. A similar thing would be true if I came over here and added 3 spaces right at the end. No change to the output. Interestingly, if I come inside this parenthesis and add 3 spaces and then hit run, we still don't see any visible change to what's occurring in the executable, and yet an actual change has occurred. Something that we'll end up studying in greater detail later is that there are ways of detecting that there are those extra 2 spaces there in the literal program. However, those spaces are not perceivable to the eye before the cursor moves to the next line. And so there is an actual change there, but how on earth we would detect that actual change is questionable at the moment, given that there's no word following world to show us just how many spaces are in between it. Although our computer was intelligent enough to see these 3 spaces here and ignore them, operating just as though there weren't any spaces, we have to be a little bit careful about where we put those spaces. Just like in the English language, if I were to put a random space in the middle of a word, that would be grammatically incorrect. The same is true of Python. Our compiler is not quite smart enough to understand that PR space int should secretly be the word print. It sees that space in the middle of a word and finds a problem with it. And look how our IDE is trying to help us notice that there's a problem. It puts what I sometimes call the red squiggle of death underneath everything that's going on here, and that's indicating that there's an issue. If I were to be obstinate and ignore the red squiggle of death and try to run the program, I would get an error message where it says syntax error, invalid syntax. Remember that we're going to make lots of syntax errors as we are first learning in Python, so get used to seeing that error a lot. Invalid syntax. It's telling you, I don't understand, you're using some of the words incorrectly. So putting a space in the middle of a function call or a reserved word for the Python programming language is problematic. Putting spaces right here was not problematic. Our computer saw those spaces, didn't really like the spaces, but ignored the spaces. And there was no problem in getting everything to run. And so maybe behind the scenes the computer was annoyed, but it wasn't so annoyed that it gave us red squiggles of death and wouldn't run our program. However, there's another way where we could make our computer very angry, and that's if we put the spaces before the print function. See that my red squiggles of death have returned, and I've got these vertical lines that mean something in this particular IDE. And again, if I were to run the program, I no longer get a syntax error, but I get an indentation error. The spaces at the very start of a line in Python are very important and are helping it understand in what order to do particular bits of code. That won't be important for us yet as we're in the introductory stages of programming, other than to just know that if you were to start spacing things out, you're going to get this very confusing error. So long story short, the long story part we'll get to later, don't put any spaces at the beginning of your lines. In general, it's best not to put those kinds of spaces since they don't really have any effect on the output anyway, but at least if you were to put spaces right here, there wouldn't be too much problem.